But before our break, we're going to hear from Britt Townsend and Sean Bowers from the Nature Conservancy. Britt is a conservation forester with TNC in Tennessee, and Sean is the Appalachian conservation forester with TNC in Kentucky. So I will turn it over to Britt and Sean.
Thanks, Will. Let me get my screen shared here. Can everyone see that?
Yes, looks good, Sean.
Perfect. All right, so yeah, good morning, everybody. Definitely, like Will had mentioned, it's great to see some patterns through all these presentations and how we're all kind of focusing in on the same similar sort of goals and walking through these processes as we are really trying to get this late successional management implemented and the thought process as we walk through all this. And today Britt and I are going to kind of talk about a project that we've got ongoing out at the Catoosa Wildlife Management area, translating the ecological goals, especially like we have used from Tony's research into something that works more for our local regionally sub-adapted forests. And so, first, it wouldn't be a TNC presentation if I didn't give a shout out to our partners. The folks at RGS, TWRA, and then other folks from TNC have been instrumental in getting this off the ground. Thanks to Will and Katie Shallows for kind of setting us up to be able to do this sort of work in our region and really make this a cooperative process where we can work together to really get this project off the ground and implemented and do some learning along the way while also improving conditions throughout our region. And so in my second point there, which is mentioned, it's kind of an experimental design for us, as there wasn't a lot of previous research or implementation in this region of the country that we could draw from. So when we were doing this, we did draw a lot from the more northern implementations of it, but our southern forests are a bit more locally adapted for some different conditions. So we had to spend a lot of thought time with ourselves and the partners to figure out how to implement this on these forests in our areas. And so with this project, it takes place in a dynamic forest restoration block, which RGS has piloted here. And the large acreage units, 5,000 plus acres of both private and public land, to achieve that kind of landscape scale heterogeneity in forest management for bird and wildlife species habitat improvement. And so what we're seeing currently is the two simple forest structures. We've got these forests that were harvested in the early 20th century, late 19th century, that then without the management taking place on those, we're seeing very similar uniform maple dominated or oak dominated forests with a large maple yellow poplar understory throughout the region. So the simple forest structure is really contributing to a loss of biodiversity, habitat, forest resilience. Hydrology is declining and is being affected. And so with the project within this DFRB, our goal was to implement a more varied forest structure at a landscape scale. That's at least the long-term goal of this project. While we're working on a kind of a relatively small acreage, we're hoping to be able to translate this into a larger, more landscape scale format for management that then can improve management across the region. And so our project's taking place at the Catoosa WMA, which is a great forest playground with 96,000 acres. With a variety of forest types, forest management. There's savanna, woodlands, closed forests, native grasslands, all sorts of different landscape units that really all come together in this area that give a lot of views at the different management techniques and allow for us to look at how this management's affecting all sorts of different habitat types in a relatively small area while still being able to implement what we're looking to have accomplished. And so here's a little bit of a map of our treatment areas. So the areas in pink are our late successional management units. And so they're both in Morgan County, Tennessee, between, I think it's about 15 to 1600 foot elevation, and they're both about 30 acres in size for our treatment units. And they, some about 60 acres in total. They had a previous harvest under the WMA management plan in about the 50s, leaving 60-ish square foot residual basal area, creating a 2-age structure with a 70-year-old mid-story, 150-year-old overstory. And so these stand structures currently as they are, there was an arson fire in 2016 that was a really high intensity fire event, caused a lot of structural variation, burned a lot of the areas up that really it became an uncontrolled wildfire there for a while. So it was a high intensity fire that really seriously affected the structure of these areas. And then the southern pine beetle kill in 2000 also took a lot of the large overstory pine component out of those stands. And so other than those events, there's been pretty little intervention in these stands since the 1950s. That led to an understory dominated by, your species like red maple, sugar maple, yellow poplar. And with that pine beetle kill, there's a large understory component of white pine, which has formed a super dense understory, really kind of limited the development of oak hickory seedlings and structure in that understory area. And so as the current stands condition, we've divided them the west and east stand, 30 acres each, 150-ish square foot of basal area. And it's an oak hickory dominant forest up here on the Cumberland Plateau with these kind of acidic, thinner soils. And so with a little intervention, it's pretty typical of what we've seen of forests across the Cumberland Plateau. You get a large, your overstory component, as well as some dense understory, typically dominated by red maple, yellow poplar, these fast growing shade intolerant species. And so these stands currently as they are overstocked, large variation in DBH range. And then, they're very closed canopy, not conducive to oak growth, hickory growth. And so the east stand, just like the west stand, is pretty similar. So in our choosing of these units, we wanted to find forests that were representative as kind of a whole of the conditions on many of our forests on the Cumberland Plateau. And so really we see this all over the region with what we're looking at. And so in our choosing of these two areas, they were pretty representative of what we were trying to emulate for hopefully when we can replicate this on a larger scale. And so taking that and taking the goals from Tony's publication, and I really liked what Sarah and Dan said about how late successional isn't an in condition, it's more of a machine that's going to continue to produce these conditions, and it's not a end goal, it's a process here. So with our goals, we wanted to retain our overstory, especially that oak hickory component, that variation throughout with the heterogeneity throughout the stand, and then like was mentioned earlier, that input of down deadwood as well as some standing snags, and that down deadwood, especially larger deadwood that's not going to be broken down nearly as quickly, as well as I'm sure it's many of our goals, the regeneration of oak and hickory, as well as variation in structure, like I mentioned, the snags, tip up mounds from the overstory mortality with these stands. We're not really going to be able to get in with heavy machinery, so we're going to rely on wind events to create these tip up mountains when the overstory does die, and hopefully can get those micro habitat variations and structure variations from that, as well as these forests are fire adapted, and so the fire adapted plant communities with the restricted fire regime that we've had, hopefully we can promote these fire adapted communities as we conduct this management within the stands. Britt, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll take it over. Thanks, Sean. If you could, you can leave it right here on this slide. So I just want to emphasize that, we are at the very beginning stages of this project. We just started, we just got the funding last fall. we have been working as a team very closely with RGS and TWRA's foresters to think through this. As Sean had mentioned, there was a long thought process on not only the ecological goals, but particularly these prescriptions on how we can manage for late successional characteristics in this fire-adapted forest. So the ecological goals that Sean just had up on the screen are very familiar to all of us, right? They came from Tony and Paul's research, mostly in these northern Appalachian forests, but as you see, Catoosa is not a northern hardwood forest. So we spent a lot of time on Zoom meetings discussing these ecological goals and how they fit in a southern Appalachian forest, right? A dry, fire-adapted oak, hickory, pine forest in Tennessee. So we stuck with many of the tried and true ecological goals of the northern Appalachian forest research, retaining old trees, but with an emphasis on leaving oaks. That's a very important component in our oak, hickory, pine forests here in the South. Improving spatial variation in multiple canopy layers, but with an emphasis on promoting oak regeneration, particularly white oak regeneration. And lastly, as Sean mentioned, these are fire-adapted communities, so promoting species that can tolerate at least some interval of fire is really important to maintain. So we needed to come up with treatments that make the most sense for how we achieve these goals. And like I mentioned, as a team, we had a lot of discussion around what prescriptions make sense, where and when. So I'm going to go through a few of these with you, but I would invite you to ask questions or email Sean and I if you'd like to discuss specifics further. One of the hot topics for this team was how and what method we were going to use to promote regeneration in this late successional forest. And we opted for creating a series of gaps and reserves that would mimic a patchwork of sorts or a mosaic of closed and open canopies. How big and how many gaps depends on how open or closed the canopy should be. And we had a great discussion in the woods on whether or not we were managing the site to be a late successional woodland or a late successional closed canopy forest. So up here on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee and Kentucky, we had both of those systems were present on the landscape. So we agreed after some discussion that we would manage for the latter. And so we actually went back and reduced our gap sizes to mimic those very small disturbances such as strong wind events that are pretty common here on the plateau that remove 1 or 2 large trees from the canopy. And in order to maintain these closed canopy characteristics of late successional oak hickory forest, we kept the gap sizes small, so anywhere from 1/10 to 1/4 of an acre, with no more than 10% of the stand in gaps. So we also recognize that in order to maintain this particular species diversity and canopy cover, we needed to reserve areas from any sort of treatment. So we established reserves, which were generally areas that have a strong oak component in the overstory, or were serving as a transition zone between adjacent stands that were being managed for other things. So while these stands have a lot of good late successional characteristics in place, the west stand, Sean had showed a picture of that earlier, it needs quite a bit of work in order to create the diverse midstory that we're looking for. So the Catoosa WMA has quite an overabundance of white pine on the landscape from past management practices decades ago that promoted planting of white pine and just general fire suppression. And while we think white pine was a small component of late successional forests on the plateau, almost the entire midstory, particularly in the west stand, is composed of white pine. So we're going to be using fire as a tool to help us thin out white pine in the midstory, and we'll be using herbicide to reduce some of the other hardwood species like red maple and yellow poplar that are fire intolerant. So next slide, Sean. There we go. Okay. So this was a map created by RGS, and Nick and his team did a fantastic job in helping us put together a management plan for these stands. And so Nick's team developed kind of just a sketch here of what this looks like. And this is again we're going to just focus in on the west stand. Yeah, but both sites are very similar. So the green patches are gaps, and then the pink patches are reserves, and then there's a light blue area that designates a crop tree release. So we've got some nice white oak in the mid-story, and we're gonna release those white oak in that area. The large pink area kind of in that southwestern corner is a transitional zone. So that's a large reserve that we're leaving. It's got a lot of the oak and hickory component in the overstory that we're looking for. It also is sort of a buffer. You can kind of see in that lower corner there, it looks like a clear cut, but that was actually a wildfire that happened in 2016. And so the pink area, that large block there is quite open as the fire pushed in to the stand and was able to thin out some of the mid-story. And it's just a really great buffer, like a transition zone between kind of this hard open area and kind of a more closed canopy system. So we thought we would leave this as a reserve. So, oh, we got a question. How many acres is this whole area on the slide? So this is about 30 acres. So we've got 2 stands that we're implementing these treatments on, 60 acres total between the 2 stands, but each stand is 30 acres in size. So next slide, Sean. Yeah, keep questions coming. So again, can't take credit for any of this. Many thanks to Nick and his team. He's got a great forester, Zach, who was able to plug in some of these the stand conditions in FBS, and then show us some really cool current and post treatments. And so this is just an example for all of you visual learners out there of again, we're looking at the west stand, and we're looking at a current gap or a current area that we're going to create a gap in, and then what it would look like post treatment. So, and again, we will be using mostly hack and squirt and girdling to create these gaps in these particular stands. So we were unable to do a commercial timber harvest in this area for a number of reasons. So we're going to be using fire and herbicide as our primary tools for regeneration. Next. So another model here for our mid-story removal. Again, a lot of the stand, the entire mid-story is just full of white pine. I have a picture here, I believe, on the next slide, just to show you. And again, we'll use fire to help us thin out that mid-story so that we can hopefully get some good regeneration of our focal species, or our oaks, our hickories, and other species that we want to see hopefully regenerate in this area. Next. Okay, yeah, so here's a couple pictures, just again, of current conditions. We were out in the field last week, actually, so this presentation is like hot off the press. So we were out with RGS and TWRA there on the left-hand side, standing in what will be a gap. You can see the white pine presence in the mid-story, and really just prevents anything else from regenerating in that area. And we're okay with leaving some white pine as a component of the stand. As I mentioned, historically, we think we would have seen at least a little bit of white pine in this area. But there's just an overabundance of it. And so we need to almost kind of go back to set this stand up for what we're trying to achieve. And I think being able to return fire back to this area and try and thin out some of this mid-story will help us improve some regeneration. And then next on the right is the picture of a reserve. This is that large pink block that I showed you in that southwest corner. That's that transitional zone between our late successional closed canopy forest management and then that 2016 wildfire on the other side. So you can see it's quite open, and we think this is going to be a great transition zone between these two areas. Next. Okay, so we talked about like having late successional characteristics already present in these areas, and Sean talked about why there was already some really good characteristics, and this is one of the reasons why we chose these stands. So we've got an incredible amount of snags already present in these areas. These were actually white pine mortality from pine beetle. And these are everywhere, and they're great habitat for, as we all know, for bats and woodpeckers. And so having these already present, these standing dead snags in the overstory is definitely great to see. We've got tip-up mounds. I wouldn't say that they're 100% natural tip-up mounds. This was kind of left over from some road maintenance, construction, long time ago, decades ago, but they're here, and we've got sensitive plants that are growing on these tip-up mounds, and they're scattered throughout the stand. So again, nice to see that we've already got some of these characteristics in place. Next. And then lastly is our timeline. I mentioned we're right, at the start of this project. We're going to be starting treatments this fall with our herbicide and girdling. We're going to be putting in a fire line so we can actually do the first fire in the stand, and we hope to achieve that burn in the spring of 2025. So I'll end by saying that, like nearly probably all of us at some point came to this project having never managed a forest or stand for late successional characteristics. So the Nature Conservancy manages a large property about an hour south of Catoosa, which is also another Cumberland Plateau oak hickory forest. But up until this point, we've been really focused on managing this forest for oak and shortleaf pine woodlands, not necessarily late successional habitat. But when I heard about this project, I was really intrigued. So I'm always looking for ways to connect TNC's forest conservation strategies with private landowners, and managing a forest for late successional characteristics could be a really great way to introduce many landowners to forest management who may not be interested in pursuing these, a larger scale commercial timber harvest, or altering their forest in a way that could affect, private landowners' number one reason for owning land, which is to preserve the beauty of their property, right? So it's a light footprint, it's a light touch that I feel like it would be a really, really great introduction into forest management for a lot of landowners. And then, lastly, as some of you might be aware, TNC and AFF are rolling out our Family Forest Carbon Program here in the South. We've done this successfully in other parts of the country, but this is just naturally, as you might expect, there are some timber harvest restrictions on carbon programs, and our Family Forest Carbon Program is no different. But this relatively light impact of managing a forest for late successional characteristics does a number of things that align with the carbon program, right? This strategy for management fosters, habitat for different species who depend on late successional forests. It retains the beauty of big old trees, because what landowner doesn't love big, beautiful trees? But it also promotes the storage of carbon. So this pilot project at Catoosa could potentially demonstrate another way private and state lands could manage particular forest stands for carbon storage, while also promoting, other ecological benefits and aesthetics.